Japan is a nation that is one of the world's most resource poor. With barely any natural reserves of coal or oil, a pittance amount of minerals, and hardly any arable land to speak of, Japan is forced to import nearly all of its industrial inputs. The country's terrain is rough, and most of it is inhospitable, making the construction of infrastructure a nightmare. Japan also spent most of its history as a relative backwater in the global trade network. Yet in spite of all of this, Japan managed to become the world's third largest economy and wields its second most powerful navy. No other nation has subverted expectations at this scale, truly making Japan history's most unexpected superpower. In this video, I will explore Japan's geopolitics in depth and analyze how Japan was able to succeed where many other nations failed. As always, I will analyze Japan's geopolitics by assigning it a score from F to S in 8 categories, F being the lowest and S being the highest. At the end of this video, I will take the average of these scores to rank Japan's geopolitical status. Geography is destiny for most nations of the world, and Japan is no exception. The most striking feature of Japan's geography are the mountainous islands which comprise the entirety of the country. This difficult terrain has created a double-edged sword which has defined Japan throughout its history. While the nation is well insulated from external threats, the rough terrain has also made the nation difficult to unite from within. For most of Japan's history, Japan was only nominally unified. While Japan was in theory ruled by a deity emperor, in actuality, it was a decentralized state. The real source of power emanated from daimyos that vied with each other for dominance. While this decentralized equilibrium ended in the 19th century, Japan still remains beholden to the same treacherous geography that defined its past. 75% of the nation is mountainous, and only 11.7% of it is arable, making any sort of infrastructure or development exponentially more expensive. Japan's largest continuous area of flat land is the Kanto Plain, home to the capital Tokyo, but even this area is only 1,300 square kilometers in size. To put that into perspective, 38 million people, a third of Japan's entire population, live in an area not even the size of the US state of Connecticut. Such geography would spell doom for most countries, but Japan has a saving grace. It's nearly 30,000 kilometers of shallow coastline, home to many natural harbors. Japan's coast not only facilitates economic activity otherwise made impossible by its rough terrain, but it also puts the country at a distance from those who wish to attack it. To conclude on this category, in terms of geographic security, Japan's defenses are impregnable. While Japan's rough terrain presents some economic hurdles, these issues are by no means insurmountable. Japan earns a score of A for this category. The structure of Japan's modern government began to be formulated in its medieval period. Though Japan exists today as a united country, Japan's early government was relatively weak and decentralized. Daimyos competed with each other for power through bloody conflicts. While the emperor was revered, he had very little political authority. This decentralized structure of government started to give way when the Tokugawa shogunate was established at the turn of the 16th century. This new order ended centuries of civil war and created a central government. The emperor continued to maintain a significant role in Japanese society, but the real source of political authority emanated from the new shogun and his bakufu. The origins of Japan's modern, federalized government are found here. This government was an initially aggressive one, attempting and failing to conquer Korea in its early years. After this failed attempt, the government turned its attention inwards and implemented Sakoku law, closing down the country to all foreigners except for Dutch merchants. The Dutch would introduce Western ideas into Japan, allowing for the nation to gradually develop. This status quo was overturned in the mid-19th century when an American fleet led by Matthew Perry bombarded the city of Edo, and demanded that Japan open up trade relations with other nations. Japan, whose navy was then vastly inferior to that of the nations of the West, had no choice but to accept. Japan signed the Treaty of Kanagawa in 1854, allowing the United States and other Western nations to conduct trade in Japan. This spurred a reaction from several influential daimyos, most notably the daimyos of Chosu and Satsuma, who viewed the shogun's deference to the West as weak and dishonorable. All this occurred under the backdrop of Japan's changing economic nature, causing the unemployment of several samurai, the nation's feudal military class. These samurai were known as ronin, frustrated soldiers who aimlessly roamed the country in search of employment. These tensions were further exacerbated by Japan's trade with the West, bringing in Enlightenment ideas about government. The stage was set for a revolution. Chosu and Satsuma, the daimyos mentioned earlier, took up the emperor as their banner and declared themselves imperial restorationists, vowing to restore the political authority of the emperor by deposing the Bakufu. By the end of this revolution, the shogunate was abolished. This would mark the beginning of great progress in Japan. During a period that would become known as the Meiji Restoration, Japan recruited the help of Western advisors to help westernize Japan. Japan overhauled its education system, went through massive infrastructure projects, and began to industrialize rapidly. However, this progress did not occur under democratic rule. While Japan formally had become a constitutional monarchy, the next few decades of Japanese history would reveal that the military was in control, ultimately leading to World War II in the Pacific. Though the state was militaristic in nature, it still was based on aspects of a Western government. This government was centralized, contained a legislative body, and, in theory, was governed by a constitution. These characteristics would make Japan's transition to democracy following World War II relatively smooth. Japan ratified its new constitution in 1951, which, along with establishing typical democratic institutions, made it illegal for Japan to have a military. This would become a topic of serious contention, but that will be discussed in further detail in the military power section. Since the inception of Japan's democracy, its political scene has been dominated by the Liberal Democratic Party, a center-right, pro-capitalist, pro-American coalition. Since 1951, the Liberal Democratic Party has controlled all branches of government, excluding a brief 6-year period. This has ensured that Japan's government favors the status quo, resulting in mostly incremental political change. At the same time, Japan has short terms for government officials, allowing for the government to be flexible when necessary. Taking all of this into consideration, both Japan's past and present, the nation certainly has a unique political identity. While much of Japan's early history was defined by political strife, the nation seems to have moved past it. Japan's government has proven itself to be uniquely stable, even amongst other democracies. Japan scores an A for this category. For most of Japan's history, its economy was isolated from the rest of the world. As a result, the diffusion of new goods and technologies into Japan was quite slow. This was made worse by the establishment of Sakoku law by the Tokugawa shogunate, which put heavy restrictions on international trade. When Japan began to industrialize, the severity of this issue intensified. With no domestic natural resources, Japan was left with no choice but to import every last ounce of its industrial inputs. This was one of the factors that led to Japan's militarism in the early 20th century, as Japan needed to expand to secure these imports. However, in the post-war international order governed by the omnipresent Navy of America, Japan gained the ability to import all that it needed, becoming both peaceful and prosperous. Its economy grew at an average rate of 6% between 1960 and 1990, soon earning its title as the Miracle Economy of East Asia. By 1968, it had already become the world's third largest economy, and became its second largest after the Soviet Union's collapse in 1991. Unfortunately for Japan, this growth wouldn't last forever. In the early years of the 90s, Japan entered a deep recession when its asset price bubble burst. To counteract the economic disaster, Japan's government started massive deficit spending and sold bonds to its citizens at unprecedented volumes. The result was one of the highest debt-to-GDP ratios the world had ever seen, combined with a stagnant economy. Still, Japan had managed to fend off its recession, and by the turn of the millennium, its economy had started to grow again. Currently, Japan's debt-to-GDP ratio sits at 235%. This figure may seem calamitous, considering that Greece went through a debt crisis when its debt-to-GDP ratio was 179%. However, Japan has an advantage that Greece lacked. Most of its debt is publicly owned. Recall that Japan earned most of its debt when it sold bonds to its citizens, meaning that most of Japan's debt is domestically held. Only 7% of Japan's debt is held by foreign countries. Japan's citizens, whose economic well-being is directly dependent on the continuation of Japan's economic well-being, have much more of an interest in ensuring that Japan does not default on its debt than a foreign country would. This has resulted in an equilibrium where Japanese citizens have accepted Japan's high debt as an inherent part of the economy. There is very little uncertainty about the ability of the Japanese government to slowly pay off old bonds as they are due, making them a continually safe investment for Japanese citizens seeking a low but constant return. In conclusion, while Japan's high debt is by no means desirable, it does not necessarily spell doom for the country, as may seem at first glance. Japan's economy is otherwise very solid. Japan has a PPP GDP per capita of 50,000, ranking as the 32nd highest in the world. Japan's total nominal GDP of just over 5 trillion places the nation as the third largest economy. While Japan has both high debt and deflation caused by the lingering effects of the asset price bubble, these structural issues have recently started to be addressed. Japan's Prime Minister, Shinzo Abe, has initiated reforms in the Japanese economy with his 3 Arrows plan. He's initially seen some modest success, as since he took office in 2012, Japan's GDP has grown steadily at an average rate of just over 1%, putting an end to 2 decades of economic stagnation. While Japan's economy certainly has its issues, it is unlikely to face any significant challenges in the near future. This earns the nation a score of A for its economic stability. Also very relevant to Japan's economy are its demographics. Japan's aging population played a large part in its 2 decades of economic stagnation. With a population growth rate of negative 0.27%, Japan is one of the few countries in the world that has a shrinking population. Japan has neither war nor famine to blame for this. It simply owes this reality to its top-heavy demographic structure. A staggering 41% of its population is above the age of 55, and 29% of the population is at or above the age of retirement. This issue shows no sign of reversing itself, as Japan has a total fertility rate of 1.43 births per woman. For comparison, the replacement rate is 2.1 births per woman, and the average rate of all developed nations is 1.6. This makes Japan's future demographic prospects even bleaker than they already were. Japan also has an unusually low immigration rate for a high-income economy, with a net migration rate of exactly 0 migrants per 1,000. Japan is a primarily consumption-based economy. 55.5% of its GDP comes from consumption, making its demographic structure problematic for several reasons. First, consumption-based economies rely on having a large base of consumers. As the largest consumers tend to be young people, Japan's demographic imbalance is a serious issue if the current structure of its economy persists. Second, consumption-based economies, and pretty much all economies for that matter, rely on having a large labor force for production. Again, Japan's declining population, combined with its high percentage of retirees, is an obvious issue on that front. While the first issue is nearly impossible to address without attacking the problem at its core, and finding a way to increase the working age population, the second issue is not as terminal. Japan sits at the forefront of labor automation technology, allowing the nation to maintain a consistent level of productivity even as its labor force shrinks. Japan's workforce is also one of the world's most productive. Among OECD countries, Japan has the 5th highest labor participation rate at 85.5%. It also has its second lowest unemployment rate at an impressive 2.4%. This allows for Japan to mobilize its working age population at a rate high enough to mitigate some of the problems caused by its weak demographics. These attributes are the saving grace of Japan's otherwise grim demographics. As such, the nation earns a grade of D for this category. Though Japan was a very divided nation for much of its history, Japan today is a much different story. Following the Meiji Restoration, factionalism significantly subsided in Japan. This change was a result of Japan's shift from a feudal to a federal way of governing. Japan's past disunity was not a result of social discord. It emanated from the political struggle between competing daimyos. Therefore, by shifting the balance of political power to favor a central governing authority, Japan was able to consolidate the unity of its society. As a result, modern-day Japan faces very few threats to its social unity, with 98% of the population being Japanese in ethnicity and 70% following the Shinto religion. Ethnic or religious separatism is a non-factor in Japan's geopolitical situation, and with a low unemployment rate, any other radical social movements have to overcome a lot of inertia. Japan is all but impervious from any potential threats to its social unity. As such, Japan earns the top mark for this category, a grade of S. Now to address the main part of what made Japan's rise to superpower status as surprising as it was, its complete lack of natural resources. Japan is a highly mountainous country, with only 11.7% of the land being arable. What little land is arable is mostly taken up by Japan's dense urban centers, leaving hardly any room for cropland. This has resulted in Japan having a food import-to-export rate of 42-1, meaning that Japan imports 42 metric tons of food for every ton it exports. This ratio is by far the worst of any country in the G20. For comparison, Saudi Arabia, a country that is almost entirely desert, has a food import-to-export ratio of 7-1. Typically, such a figure would put any nation on the brink of starvation, especially in a world where America's security commitments are wavering. However, a world without American defensive trade routes does not necessarily spell doom for Japan. As will be discussed in the military power section, Japan is more than capable of defending its interests. In brief, Japan possesses the world's second most powerful navy. If any country can survive importing food at a 42-1 ratio, it's Japan. With this in mind, Japan earns a score of C for this category. While Japan can never hope to be a food-independent nation, it has the means necessary to continue its status quo. Japan's energy security situation is very similar to its food security one. The nation imports more coal than any other nation in the world. It also imports the second most natural gas and fourth most crude oil. As 71% of Japan's energy comes from these fossil fuels, the nation is heavily dependent on the importation of these resources for its survival. Japan's ability to diversify its energy portfolio with green energy is also very limited, as the nation's wet climate and relatively docile winds limit the potential of solar and wind power. Furthermore, after the Fukushima nuclear disaster in 2011, the population of Japan is very wary of adopting nuclear energy. While Prime Minister Shinzo Abe is attempting to slowly reintroduce nuclear energy to the country, this would not change much in regards to Japan's energy security situation, as the nuclear fuel needed for the reactors would also need to be imported. This leaves Japan facing a grim reality. It must continue to import the great majority of its energy, even in a world with more uncertainty around the security of global energy markets. However, as was stated earlier, the strength of Japan's navy makes this issue not as significant of a problem as it may seem. As such, Japan earns the same score for this category that it did for its food security, a grade of C. Japan's military power is arguably its most important geopolitical asset. As the nation is heavily dependent on importing natural resources, it is vital for Japan to maintain a military significant enough to maintain these imports. And at a glance, Japan very much possesses such a military. The nation spends the 7th most in the world on its military. While in per capita terms this is less than average, as Japan is the 3rd largest economy, it is still a significant amount. Japan has put this money to good use, equipping itself with arguably the second most powerful navy in the world. Japan possesses 4 aircraft carriers and 34 destroyers, placing it in second for both of these categories. As for the other branches of its military, Japan owns 623 military aircraft and owns 11 military satellites, which places Japan in 5th for each category. Finally, Japan has the technological capability of building nuclear weapons, should it need to. However, Japan's security situation extends far beyond these statistics. What is more important is Japan's relationship with the United States. Japan was a belligerent force throughout its early modern history, and when its militarism was ultimately put to an end by the Allies in World War II, the victorious nations, specifically America, made sure that Japan would not be able to inflict such devastation again. To achieve this goal, the United States signed a security treaty with Japan in 1951. The first draft of the treaty outlined a few restrictions on Japan's military. Essentially, America was established as the guarantor of Japan's security, and the size and capability of Japan's domestic military was severely limited. However, with both concerns over Japan's militarism and the presence of America's military on the island waning over the last half-century, the dynamic established by the treaty has changed. Japan's constitution, written in the same year, has gradually been reinterpreted to allow Japan to take more agency in its security arrangement. A watermark event for the shift was seen in 2015 when legislation reinterpreted the constitution to allow for Japan to decide for itself when to apply military force, with a few conditions that require Japan to coordinate with the United States military in such an event. This explains the nation's recent military buildup, and further changes to Japan's constitution in this direction are to be expected. Japan is prepared for a world where it has to be its own defender. However distant that world is, only time will tell. Regardless, Japan's military as it stands is very capable. The nation earns a score of A for this category. Japan's geopolitical profile is perhaps the most asymmetric of any of the major players. Japan remains a prisoner of its inherent geographic flaws. Combine this with weak demographics, and Japan's position seems to be far from ideal. But this isn't the full picture of Japan. Japan has managed to overcome all odds and position itself as one of the most formidable economies in the world, all the while boasting one of its most powerful navies. Japan is truly history's most unexpected superpower. If Japan continues on its current trajectory, it will in all likelihood remain a relevant player. However, such inescapable negatives will continue to limit the potential of Japan. While Japan will not likely rise to dominate East Asia as it did in its early modern history, its relative power will still persist. With that said, Japan receives a final ranking of A. This concludes my report on Japan's geopolitics. If you enjoyed the video and would like to see more geopolitical profiles of various nations, be sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching.